the world since 2020, the gloves were really coming off.
How likely is it that we will see a China-Taiwan military conflict in the near future?
And so if it does come to blockade, whether the West is really prepared to take the pain that might involve.
Military force is more likely to be used than maybe we would have believed 5, 10, 15 years ago. One of the problems with taking agents out of your own country and sending them home and vice versa is actually you start to get lesser knowledge on what your adversary is doing. Fear mounts, suspicion mounts, and then you have higher chance of miscalculations.
Justin, I agree with you on all points except one. I don't believe it's about values.
The other change that's obviously on the horizon is a change in Washington.
You see a lot of people saying a Trump presidency means this for China, it means this for Iran. I'm not sure it necessarily does.
Hello, it's Capital Horizons, the podcast where money meets politics. I'm Igor Yelnik. This is Sir Michael Fallon. Our guest today is Justin Crump, the CEO of Sibylline, a strategic advisory firm. Hi, Justin. Thank you very much for joining us.
Good to see you both.
Justin, there are a few military conflicts which are taking place right now. How likely is it that we will see the China-Taiwan military conflict in the near future?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly the conflict that hasn't happened yet that people are most worried about, because obviously we have ongoing conflict in Ukraine, we have ongoing conflict in the Middle East, and I think China-Taiwan needs to be seen in the context of these other conflicts first and foremost. And I think the fact that we've seen those conflicts emerge in the way we have has increased people's fear that military force is more likely to be used than maybe we would have believed 5, 10, 15 years ago. But for China and Taiwan, I think militarily, it's a very difficult challenge for Beijing to attack the island, to take it by force. It's a very difficult target. It'd be a hugely complex operation. And there's a comparatively high risk of failure and, of course, escalation. So I think for the Chinese government, military force actually being deployed is the very last stage. And I think in the classic form of Sun Tzu, they'd rather win their battles without having to fight, if you know what I mean. So they would much rather, I think, achieve unification with the island that didn't involve fighting. But of course, posturing military force is part of bringing pressure to bear to bring about an outcome without actual armed conflict. So they have to be prepared to do it. They have to show they could do it. But I think that doesn't mean necessarily that China is absolutely looking at a military option, that this is inevitable. I think for them, it's almost a last resort or an end stage. And there are many questions about the United States' role in this, for example, regional dynamics. And so I think it's probably too much concern over an imminent military action. It doesn't mean it won't happen. But I think there are many other things to play out first within that military framework.
Perhaps I could press you a little bit on that, Justin. To what extent do you think the conflict in Ukraine has actually altered some of those dynamics?
In the world since 2020, the gloves were really coming off. And I think Russia's invasion of Ukraine being the thing that really pulled the rug out from our expectations of global order and what that could look like. I think that was the event that generally shocked people, that actually we can see big changes. We can see aggressive actions between more major powers. And so I think it definitely tilted the scales, and I think it showed that the US-led order was under serious threat, that there were alternatives, and we'd sort of seen the end of that peace dividend from the Cold War, which of course you know so well, given your own background. And I think that transition is what's woken up a lot of the world, and people are seeing opportunities in that, as well as risks, of course. And we focus very much on the risks when we talk about a lot of this, but there are opportunities, particularly for nations that have, if you like, more options than just towing the US line. And I think so within that global context of the axis of the excluded, as we've sometimes called it, there are lots of names for it, but the alternate really to US-led power around the world and US-led order, I think that is driving people towards new alternatives, and it's making new outcomes more acceptable. I think traditional alliances are potentially fraying, new alliances are being formed, and things that we've seen as certainties over the last 30 years are being shaken. So people are finding a new way through as a result of Ukraine. And I think that does play into China-Taiwan, because what was be seen as almost academic or unthinkable before becomes more possible when we realize we're in a dangerous age. And perhaps people in the 1930s would have said, well, good job, we will never have the Great War again. But of course, then you ended up with the Second World War and some similar dynamics playing out here. Are we entering a third world war? I don't necessarily think so, but the fact that we're considering that quite actively, I think was almost unthinkable. And certainly in your own time in government, I think if 10 years ago I'd come along to you and said this is what we'd be looking at inside 10 years, I'm not sure you'd have necessarily believed me, or certainly been able to win arguments inside government about the threat we could be facing. So I think it shows how quickly things can change. And I think, again, this gradually changing order means outcomes like China-Taiwan are more possible than they were. Indeed, North Korea, South Korea, more possible than it was even a week ago. So I think we're looking at all of these things become more uncertain. There's therefore more volatility. There's therefore more risk. But of course, there is more opportunity sometimes within that risk as well, obviously, if all-out conflict is avoided.
Well, I agree with all of that. Just coming back to the way you sketched out the military difficulty of China in actually taking Taiwan, are there military solutions short of invasion? Is it feasible really for China to mount a blockade, which obviously might work both ways?
Yeah, and I think that is certainly what my team is tracking as one of the more likely outcomes, or if you like, negative scenario outcomes of this, is a blockade, because that test resolve, in a way, it's almost already happening. We're at the thin end of that wedge in terms of the incursions across the median line in the strait, the incursions around Taiwan, the positioning of Beijing's assets around the island on exercises, which of course are claimed to be spontaneous, but we know that these exercises have been prepared long in advance, because you don't just pull these things together at that sort of speed. And so this is all posturing towards eventually a form of blockade. If you like, at the moment, there's almost a mental blockade starting to go on around Taiwan and its interests. And I think it's that move towards an actual blockade. Arguably, Beijing needs the pretexts to do so, but they're being offered those, I think, easily enough in the direction of Taiwanese politics at the moment. And they can find excuses to do things. So, it's not a non-trivial move, but I think that blockade of the island that stops short of conflict, and what we've seen so commonly in these grey zones short of conflict around the world, or short of open-armed kinetic violence around the world, have been very effective, actually. And so I think something like that is much more probable in terms of a most likely and worst scenario to consider. I think that's the one people should be looking at. And of course, the ramifications that everyone focuses on are semiconductors, and things like that of course we're very dependent on from Taiwan. There are moves to change that, but it's not a quick process. So that could be quite painful, although it cuts both ways, you say. So risk versus opportunity for Beijing in pursuing that course. But an attempted blockade, you can start it, you can step back, and you can escalate and de-escalate from that position. When people start killing each other, as we know, that's when it gets hard to de-escalate. Sorry, Michael.
But one question I'm often asked in Washington is, if it does come to a blockade and the reprisal, which would be presumably some form of sanction against China, whether the European West is really prepared to take the pain that might involve.
Well, and absolutely. And China, of course, has learnt from what's happened with Russia, and it's been moving over the last couple of years to sanction-proof its economy more. And indeed, lots of other nations have been somewhat shocked, I think, by the scale of the US-led moves against Russia. And if you like, the weaponization of trade and other things. And you could debate, whether that was the right thing to do or not. But nonetheless, other nations have looked at this and said, this is pretty shocking, and particularly in the Middle East. And I think if you look at where China has expanded some of its influence into the Middle East, into North Africa, interestingly, Morocco, Egypt, as markets that effectively allow it to bridge the gap towards the US, to bridge the gap towards the EU, and work around any sanction measures. I think it shows that China is thinking about the way in which they might face reprisals and what to do about it. But stockpiles of food, stockpiles of gold, currency, etc., that the Chinese have been working with, I think shows how they're considering the effect of sanctions. They want to be prepared for it. It doesn't, again, mean they're preparing to do something, but they need to be prepared in case they do something. And I think that, to them, slightly mitigates some of the US responses, make it more painful. And then for the rest of the world, as you say, are they going to follow the lead about a more esoteric issue of Taiwan when potentially they're already exhausted about the issue of Russia, which the sanctions against which have not necessarily proved completely effective? We know that sanctions rarely are totally effective. Iran, I think one of the most sanctioned nations on earth, still struggling along, although in great pain at the moment domestically. So I think other nations may or may not follow suit, especially with changes of government. And we're in the middle of this year of elections, and we've got a few caucus yet to come, haven't we? So I think it'll be interesting to see how that develops and how that affects the resolve to back the US to the hilt. And of course, it depends who the next US president is and what their overall policies are, as well as European leadership, UK leadership, and people's willingness to get dragged into it. And the more clear-cut the case, as we saw with Russia and Ukraine, I think the more that other nations are willing to say, okay, we must support this. This is a moral issue. The less clear-cut the case, the more nations can say, this isn't really our fight. We don't want to get involved. This is too risky for us in the abstract, let alone, of course, the trade ties with China, which they built up carefully and patiently. I would caution, though, of course, the argument that trade ties stop us from going into conflict have been deployed a few times in the past, and it hasn't always worked as anticipated if a country is willing to take the risk and the pain.
I'd like to get back to your point about the military engagement being the last resort for China. What can push China to this last resort and attack or blockade Taiwan?
Yeah, and I will say, though, it's sort of the last resort. There are, of course, times that it might be the best option for China eventually. And, of course, it's all based on a strategic balance. So there are times, I mean, ultimately, the time that you would do it was a time when you think it's going to get you the best result at the least cost. So triggers to that are largely linked to the external scenario where this becomes the option China either has to take because it has no other option. And if you like, that's a little bit parallel to Japan in 1941, where they felt if they didn't try to fight the US, they were eventually going to have to give up their positions entirely, in the face of pressure they were facing from the US. So sometimes when you back an adversary into a corner and give them two options, they might take the option you didn't want them to take and that you didn't expect them to take. So that is one scenario where Beijing thinks actually this is the best cost-benefit path of action that we can take. Our credibility, our political credibility is at stake. And of course, that could be driven by things like mass unrest in China around other issues where a foreign distraction was useful. That's a bit of a hypothetical at the moment. Or where national pride was just so affronted that the leadership in Beijing felt they had no option but to do something. For example, a real declaration of independence, US alliance, something that really changed the balance. And of course, within that mix as well, you've got the weight of US pressure and support. So if US support for Taiwan is seen to be negotiable, if it's seen to be something that the US would give up on, and we've often had these issues where our support for something was or wasn't clear, and therefore mistakes happened because people calculated that another nation wouldn't act, and then in fact it did. And arguably Poland 1939 is an example of that, where Germany didn't think that the British and French would declare war in support of Poland. They thought they could do this action. And if Hitler had understood that Britain and France would definitely declare war in that situation, they would probably not have invaded in the way they did, at least. That was only putting off the inevitable. But I think in that event, again, there was a miscalculation that led to a war that actually Germany hadn't wanted, the UK and France didn't particularly want. And you could have that sort of scenario here where the US resolve becomes ambiguous. Now, I don't think that's particularly likely given the current trend in Washington that this is their very clear number one priority. I think that's more of a fear for people in Ukraine and Europe that that drops way down the priority order. I don't think anyone's suggesting that America would just throw Taiwan out there as a negotiating chip. But if there was a perception that the US may not fight for Taiwan, then that would increase the likelihood of military action. So there's lots of drivers. I've just given a few there. And really, it's this constant calculus. And one thing it does occasionally worry me is that if you're a war planner in Beijing who's been given the job of looking at the mission that we know that the PLA has been given of being able to take Taiwan, again, doesn't mean they will, but they have to be able to and ready to as their mission. You'll be looking at these factors all the time. There may come a point where they say, well, actually, we're not particularly ready to go, but the US is in disarray, Europe's in disarray, we're getting the green light from a few people that they wouldn't mind if it happened now. We've got options, we're sanction-proofed. But if we leave it a few years, the US will be more ready. They'll have their carrier groups maybe repositioned. They'll have new and improved weapon systems. They can counter some of our weapon systems. So our time of comparative advantage is now. And then you get the argument that if we don't go to war now, we might never be able to, and we'll lose that lever of power. So that's the other thing that's playing away. I don't think we're there, but for example, the US being embroiled in a wider conflict in the Middle East and carrier groups being deployed to that region as we're seeing at the moment, and a lack of attention on the Indo-Pacific region might be something that made someone think, actually, this balance is shifting. We have an opportunity here and we should take it. I would say, again, not the most likely, but those are the possibilities that make me concerned in an unpredictable world.
Taiwan is currently producing over 90% of all microchips under 10 nanometers. If we look at the degree of the world's dependence on these semiconductors, what should be the trigger for the US to support Taiwan declaring its independence?
I think we've seen a line crossed in this regard, haven't we, when Biden made a much more clear statement than we've seen previously that the US would fight for the island, because it's always been strategic ambiguity as a context. And I think that strategic ambiguity at this point is starting to wear very thin. I think if you just look at any comments from US leadership, US military leadership about the future war scenarios and planning and the focus, I think that is wearing thin. And as you say, the stakes around Taiwan are increasing. I mean, the more interesting point, and arguably the better opportunity for China, albeit at less cost and in future time, would actually be after people have realized that obviously we can't be critically dependent on Taiwan for the supply of these critical things, especially with the growth of AI and robotics and things are going to take more and more advantage of these small and very technical chips, as you know. And actually diversification gathers pace, which of course the US is desperately trying to do. And I think any nation at this point should be thinking very hard about where its high-end semiconductors are going to come from in future, because I think it's something that they will be, it's something they're going to be very called out by. If you haven't got a supply, again, it's been certain for the last 30, 40 years we can get these things from. Suddenly it's very uncertain and it's all coming from one place, and that's the problem. So as people diversify, eventually, of course, the economic relevance of Taiwan starts to become increasingly less. So we're almost at a point of peak US defensiveness about Taiwan, I think, at the moment. As you say, due to that cost imperative and due to the fact that we're just beginning to realize quite how reliant we are and quite how difficult it is to find alternate sources for the latest things. I mean, it's taken a lot of time and experience to build up. An effort is going into diversification, but of course, consumption rising dramatically as well. Nvidia, of course, now being the most valuable company in the world, almost totally dependent on the situation we're talking about here. It's going to take a lot for supply to catch up with demand, even with diversification. So I think that definitely increases US resolve right now, in my view. And I think all of our resolve that actually this is something we don't want to have disrupted. It was bad enough during COVID, and car manufacturers are still feeling some pain of that disruption. Imagine something of this order. And of course, whoever owns the island at the end, assuming it's in one piece, actually suddenly has this supply. And that's a strategic asset, isn't it? So, of course, the stakes in capturing that technology and, if you like, that production have become very high in a way that wasn't the case necessarily 20, 30 years ago to the same extent. So it's becoming more of an economic struggle than maybe it was when it was a moral struggle for the Chinese leadership and a point of principle once upon a time. Now this is Taiwan is a prize as well. And I think that changes the equation. One day it won't be a prize again, and then it maybe swings back to the moral component, but that could take a long while. And so I think we have this period of time where the US cannot afford to be ambiguous anymore necessarily. But of course, by being overt, it's going to be something that can be used against them again as well. We're almost back to what we had with Ukraine, where if you postured too hard in defense of Ukraine, it played into the Russian narrative and it made an attack on Ukraine potentially more likely. So people didn't want to posture on Ukraine. And trying to find that balance is very difficult, as we saw. And I think we're seeing the same again, arguably, around Taiwan, that we can't be too assertive in defense, but we also can't allow too much to go. And striking that balance will be very hard.
On one hand, you are speaking about protecting Taiwan as a defensive operation from the point of view of the US. On the other hand, you consider it as some kind of provocation which may lead China to attack Taiwan. Both of these positions can't hold together.
I think the point being that there are different ways of getting to an outcome where you have a situation, and frankly, I think the US would try to avoid. Wars happen due to miscalculations. Diplomacy is intensely difficult, as we're seeing in the Middle East, and people do the best they can to try and balance situations and work in national interest, reconcile differences, and keep everything going. And it doesn't always work, as we know. So one of the areas, as I said before, is misunderstanding of intentions from each side. And of course, the third factor, as the US has so often seen, is unfortunately you can have someone that you've decided must be a staunch ally, and then they start doing things that you don't necessarily agree with that are causing you problems on the world stage, but you can't stop being their ally. And of course, Israel is an example at the moment where, and not just at the moment, I mean, if you go back to the 1980s and Reagan's policy with Israel, it was very difficult to balance the support that you had to show with some of the things that sometimes your allies were doing that you couldn't agree with, didn't agree with, and knew were counterproductive for you, but you couldn't control that ally well enough, of course, because they're an ally, they're not a vassal state. And so there are things that Taiwan could do the US wouldn't want them to do. It then puts the US in a position where they have to make a decision. And under pressure, what do you then do? So if Taiwan pursues an independence line, more obviously, I'm pretty sure the US would say you need to tone this down a bit. I think that would be the diplomatic message from the US. But of course, you have other members of the US government saying we must defend Taiwan. It's a critical issue. We're going to visit the island. Of course, Nancy Pelosi's visit was one of the things that cued the large-scale increase in Chinese exercises. But they had that planned. That wasn't just a spur-of-the-moment thing, and it was in the traditional exercise season. We'll see that again, I'm sure, this summer. So there are other things that are just beyond people's control. And I think that's my bigger point in this, that as far as I can see, how we get there is a combination of lots of different factors, and that could just be errors, someone misspeaking, miscalculation, over-aggressiveness, lack of understanding of each other. And that is the problem with where we are. And we've seen this a bit with Russia as well and others, where as you start to move into positions of increasing conflict, there's less and less understanding necessarily of where you are. And one of the problems with taking known espionage agents out of your own country and sending them home and vice versa is actually you start to get less and less real knowledge on what your adversary is doing because you're clamping down on that knowledge. You're getting fewer back channels, you're getting less intelligence information on each other. So fear mounts, suspicion mounts, and then you have higher chance of miscalculations, bigger reactions to those miscalculations, potentially driven by domestic politics. And that takes you to this state. I said, all things being rational, it's hard to see that there should be a fight over Taiwan. I think that would be a failure of Chinese policy to some extent if they ended up in a conflict, unless they could literally walk ashore and win. I think China certainly wouldn't want to be in an all-out shooting war with the US over Taiwan. It's immensely destructive to both countries. The US wouldn't want that either. I don't think anyone in the region wants to see that. But everyone's posturing on the edge of that, and that's why the risk is elevated. So again, it's thinking about things that could tilt that risk rather than saying it's a plausible scenario that the US would do X, that China would do Y. It's how we end up in a position that actually I don't think anyone wants, unless they're guaranteed victory. You don't like going to war unless it's an absolute imperative or you're guaranteed to win. And you're never guaranteed to win. So again, I come down to the point, most wars happen by miscalculation, or they're certainly protracted by miscalculation.
Could I draw you out, Justin, a little on how these various conflicts are slightly beginning to merge now, and in particular the relationship between China and Russia, which has clearly evolved, and we hear of friendship without limits and the various summits and so on. What is China's view of the Ukraine conflict? I mean, how does it want it to end?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, and China's carefully navigating a lot of lines in all of this. And, Igor, when you and I spoke before, I said this is actually the difference in a way between Russia that's gone slightly more headlong, I think, and China that's taking a more strategic, slightly more nuanced view of things. And I think at this point, obviously, China has, friendship without limits is clear. I think the visit of Putin to Xi before he embarked on the Ukraine operation, I think was not insignificant in that regard. I mean, the nations are working closely together with a shared interest. But I think as with so much of the China, Russia, Iran, North Korea sort of block that we're seeing, you can add lots of countries to that, of course, and certainly the BRICS move and other things that are sort of pulling away from that US-led view. I think the thing that they all have in common is we don't like the US-led view. And we call it an axis for that reason, because it's really against what the US is standing for, and if you like, Western values, this order. I think that's what they're standing against. They actually don't have necessarily commonalities in what they stand for, but they're very united in actually we all want to push back and we want to create more space and we want to create alternatives to the US leading everything. So I think for China and Ukraine, I mean, the ultimate overriding question is that they want to come out of it better than they went into it. They absolutely don't want to see Russia humbled, destroyed, dismantled. For them, and I think an absolutely appalling result will be Russia collapses and becomes, almost Ukraine takes over Russia mentally, if you like, and all of Russia becomes like Ukraine and is Europe-leaning, pro-US, almost part of NATO. That would obviously not happen, but I think that's the view that the Chinese would be most worried about. Is actually we've lost not only a buffer but a useful state that's now in the secondary part of the relationship. Whereas once upon a time, I think Russia lorded it more over China. In the communist era, of course, we've now seen this tilt, and Russia is definitely coming as a supplicant to China to North Korea. I mean, Russia sent MiGs to North Korea in 1950, and now we've got North Korean soldiers going to return the favour in Ukraine. It's taken a long time, but now North Koreans coming to Russia's aid. I mean, who would have necessarily called that would have seen that 10 years ago? It shows how far Russia's fallen, but China can't afford to have Russia fall completely, I don't think. They're very, very useful for them. So I think the one thing China really wants is Russia survives, and ideally is able to claim a victory, because that allows that movement, that access to say, actually, we are winning, we are pushing back, we are the alternative to the US-led order. I think, as I say, Russian failure, even if the Russian state survives, isn't the best outcome for China. And obviously a Russian collapse is probably the very worst outcome for China in this. And I think that's why you're seeing the support, and obviously work behind the scenes to try and use other third parties to try and resolve the conflict. And of course, China would like to see trade flow in order. They want to see good relationships with Europe, but a Europe that's pulling away from the US. So obviously, everything we're saying, and I'm probably anticipating it, something else would come to in the conversation, but I mean, everything comes back, of course, to the US election at some point, because that starts to define the way in which all of the nations around the world will relate to the US in future. And that's a huge factor in the outcome of this conflict, and it's a huge factor for China. So they like stability, they'd like to see improved trade, they'd like to see a breakup of that US-led dollar-denominated order. Russia is a part of that. Ukraine's sort of inconvenient for them, actually, because I think if China had known that this is the situation a Russian invasion would have ended up in, I think the Chinese would have said, well, you shouldn't do it. This doesn't help all of our longer-term aspiration and goal to create a multipolar world, because you basically forced everyone to pick sides, and this isn't ideal. At the moment, therefore, China's making the best of it. I think they'd like to see it damped down and be calmed down and stop with whatever outcome it is, as long as Russia could at least claim a victory. Then they can carry on with their own projects around the world, which have a much longer term view and a much more global view, I think, than Russia's right now.
Justin, I agree with you on all points except one. I don't believe it's about values. It's about geopolitics. It's about economic development. China is now collecting resources, in particular natural resources. China itself is rich on natural resources. Russia is rich on natural resources. China is ahead of everyone in Africa. In my view, China is building up for its long-term development and tries to control what is valuable today and what is likely to be valuable tomorrow. And these are not democratic values as we would like to think that are at stake here.
I think you're not wrong there. I think aspects of them are, because they threaten that purpose. And of course, we can chat about this, and we're giving shorter answers to things that we could spend weeks debating and talking about and going into the nuanced details, modelling in detail. And functionally, of course, everything that happens on the planet is a result of lots of individuals making decisions at some level, economics or politics, geopolitics. It's all down to lots of people's individual actions. And I don't disagree. I mean, it's not the values per se. I think it's the domination of those values. It's those values being pushed, and it's the sort of narrative that this is the way that they're pushing back against, but not for the values reason, because it's actually a very good area to exploit interest. I mean, we're back to the world of states. Fundamentally, I think we lived through that era of more values-driven things, and I think Western politics still believes itself to be values-driven, and probably is more than some others. But of course, even Western politics is not driven purely by values, as we know. There is always national interest, national pride, self-interest, cultural interest. And for China particularly, at the moment, if you look at what they're doing in the Middle East and in Africa and others, it's access to new markets. It's ways of keeping that growth going. And of course, the counter to that is if you bow down to the US view of the world, actually there isn't much space for you in it. So I think it's inevitable you come into conflict, as you say, whatever that's driven by. But if you want to compete in a relatively fixed marketplace and you have a big competitor, you're only going to get sales if you take them off your competitor. So you either have to find new areas to get sales that don't exist currently, or in the global environment, there is a bit of a zero-sum game to some extent. And so China's gain often has to be someone else's loss to some extent, whether that's access to cheap resources, whether that's access to markets, whether that's their political allegiance. But of course, what we've seen is that the area of values-based politics and geopolitics is very much under threat as a result, because, again, looking particularly in the Middle East, actually saying, look, we just don't have to do what the US says, and we don't have to follow values anymore that everyone's told us we did have to over 20, 30 years, and told us how important human rights were and came to preach to us, because we're not sure even the US follows its own values at this point. So to be honest, we have options. I think that's the biggest part of this message. But yes, of course, it always comes back to having enough money, having food for your population, not getting invaded by anyone else, and being able to invade others if you need to, and all the basics of human security. And of course, water's in there too, and there's lots of nations struggling for that potentially in the coming years. So, in that environment, we are in a struggle for supremacy, survival. It's not a ruthless and brutal one, I don't think, but of course, that's a motive for a lot of nations acting in the way they are. Fundamentally, it comes down to being able to do what they want to do, being able to feed, protect their population, and give them wealth and well-being. It's just that now I think some nations are more willing to do it at the expense of others than perhaps would have been the case 30 years ago when we were in that post-Cold War moment, and there was a feeling we could move past things. I mean, the end of history argument was very current in university in the 1990s. Francis Fukuyama saying, actually, is this it now? This is the end of history. Liberal democracy has triumphed. That's it. Even he didn't believe that argument, but we seriously debated it to say this is... we certainly wouldn't be sitting here in 2024 talking about these sorts of things anymore, because the world had moved past this era of contentious state-on-state conflicts and arguments with each other. Actually, this is the way the world's been. We've just had a great 30 years of smooth sailing in calm waters.
Indeed. Speaking of the Middle East and miscalculations, we can go back to the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916 or to the 7th of October 2023. At each point, we can find miscalculations. Where are we going to go from here?
Yeah, and we're in the situation now, talking, of course, about the next milestone, potentially being the Israeli operation on the ground into southern Lebanon and what that leads to. I mean, just in the time since 7th of October, of course, we've seen Iran launch a direct strike against Israel. And something, of course, that I think if we'd discussed this a couple of years ago, we said, well, if you imagine that happening, the whole Middle East would just be in flames, wouldn't it? It'd be absolutely appalling. And of course, actually, we seem to have got through that scenario. I think to surprise if we'd looked at this in the abstract. And in fact, if you remember, as we went into COVID, Iran fired weapons at US positions, fired ballistic missiles at US positions, and some Kurdish targets as well. And of course, everyone was on a knife edge saying this is going to be the great conflagration. So I think what's fascinating, and perhaps because there have been so many miscalculations, is actually somehow we seem to be comparatively resilient to the miscalculations in terms of preventing escalation. Again, my fear is that you reach a point where everyone's complacent, escalation can be avoided because no one wants it, and therefore everyone will mitigate it, and eventually things spill over. The Arab Spring being an example, I think, of where things got out of control for Arab leaders, and they are very worried about repeats of that with sentiment on the street over Gaza, for example, hence some of the stance that they took. So I think it's not inevitable, even with all these miscalculations going on, that it, arguably, from what you said, one could say that miscalculation in the Middle East is business as usual, and it's a case of just how bad those miscalculations get. I think on another point, you can say we've had so many at this point that it must be very dangerous. But we've been here time and time again saying, well, if there's one more thing, it's just all going to go up in flames. And it largely hasn't. So I think what happens next comes down to Iran's stance. And it is interesting that the Iraqi Shia militias like Kataib Hezbollah and people like that have publicly stated, we will go to southern Lebanon to fight, have been told by Tehran, no, you won't. We don't want you to do that. There is no point in you going there, also getting killed. We're going to lose our regional influence. And from certain points of view, I think Iran can sit back at this point and say, actually, we're doing quite well here. We haven't lost any of our positions. We've shown some ability to conduct operations via the Houthis. Hamas is still surviving in Gaza. The issue of Gaza is alienating Israel. This has done more to alienate Israel in the eyes of a lot of its supporters than anything else hitherto has really managed to do. So from Iran's point of view, to some extent, this is not actually going all that badly. And they have plenty of other problems, though, particularly their own economy, which is completely appalling, as we know. So I think there is a restraint with Iran at the moment. This is why Hezbollah has also not done more than it has done so far. Hezbollah has not started a war with Israel. It's done enough to provoke a war with Israel, but it's trying to stay the right side of that line. But it is nonetheless a flashpoint where, yes, there could be more disorder. I think, though, that Iran would hope that Israel would embark on an operation in southern Lebanon and have a repeat of 2006, be stuck in yet another quagmire on top of the situation they have in Gaza. And it puts the US in a very difficult position about what to do. It strains US resources, which is in the interest of every other nation we've discussed on this call. And so actually letting some of this happen suits these other nations. And of course, the US really, especially in the middle of the election campaign we're seeing at the moment, would really like all this to stop now. I think there's no doubt of that. This is not the crisis that anyone needed. And adding more to it is just going to have diplomats' heads in hands, I think. So there's a huge amount of work trying to mitigate things, helped by the fact that Iran doesn't want this to go too far. But again, it's another brinksmanship example, which is what we seem to keep talking about here, isn't it? It's like everything's being pushed to the brink. And I think in the conflict around Israel, every side wants to be the one that fires the last round in the conflict, to be able to say, well, we actually won because we fired the last shot. So Hezbollah, for example, wouldn't back down. They're saying we'll back down if the operations in Gaza stop. The Houthis have said we will stop when the operations in Gaza stop, because they know full well that that's really not going to happen. But actually, everyone would probably quite like things to stop at some point, but they don't want to lose. And the first person to stop loses in this situation. So it suggests a protracted standoff to some extent, I'm afraid, because there isn't an off-ramp at the moment, and partly because the Israelis, in my view, didn't have a plan for the day after the conflict in Gaza. And it was clearly going to be something that was going to drag on. And I think we're dealing with the consequences of that for regional stability, which suggests that these risks will continue across the region. Arab leaders will be potentially worried that eventually their populations will say, why haven't you done more for the Palestinians? So they're trying to manage that. Again, China is moving into the void that the US is leaving in a way by being so staunch in support of Israel, possibly, arguably, mainly for democratic political reasons in the US and others, which is not even helping the US leadership at the moment. But the US is seen to be hypocritical on Israel versus Ukraine. Whether it is or not, that's the perception. And of course, it's driving nations to look at alternatives further. So that's the situation we're in. And of course, it can always escalate. It's not in anyone's interest for it to escalate out of control currently. And we've been very close with the Iranian strike on Israel. Israel launched a few missiles back and directly hit a target with a fraction of the effort. And I think that message was heard fairly loudly in Tehran, which is one reason it's calmed down a bit. The big thing that's out there is Iran nuclear. And I think that comes down to the point at which Iran feels it needs to actually manifest a capability or not. And of course, the closer Russia, Iran, North Korea, etc. pulling together, the more chance there is more nuclear technology transfer, which you may have seen with North Korea already in return for their help. And the more dangerous some of these factors get. And I'm not sure there's a good answer to Iran nuclear development at the moment. And I'm not sure anyone quite knows what would happen if it was unveiled. And of course, Israel is probably the player in the driving seat. Coming back to what we were saying before, the US is slightly behind on all these conflicts in a way because its allies are pushing them and the US is having to deal with it, I think increasingly reluctantly in some ways. And that's the problem they face here. I think if Iran nuclear was unveiled, it's not what the US would do about it, it's what Israel might do about it and drag the US into before the US or the UK or anyone else is ready to deal with the problem. Plus, we're all distracted with our own political leadership changes, let's face it, and you can include France and Germany in that as well. Fun times, isn't it? I feel like we should have a whiskey or something if we're going to discuss this much longer.
But Justin, it isn't just Israel, is it? I mean, there's quite a strong interest in the Gulf in knowing what's likely to happen to Iran's nuclear program and what the next president, how active he's likely to be, whatever action Israel takes.
Yeah, well, I mean, if the new president even has any power. And obviously there's a thought about who the next supreme leader would be within this as well, because that was the big change, I think, of what happened a couple of months ago. Yeah, there's very strong interest. It's interesting, going back to our original talk about China, that China was the one that sort of brokered the rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And of course, even around then when Gaza started, of course, suddenly there was a case of, Saudi and Iran almost arm in arm saying, okay, what are we going to do about this situation? Whereas you think not very long ago, Iranian drones, the first big target of the Iranian Shahid type drones and things was Saudi Aramco, which is also the target of the first big Iranian cyber attack. And suddenly actually the two states are pulling together quite well when there's something much more interesting going on that they can agree on, which I'm afraid is traditional Middle Eastern politics slightly, isn't it? It's not quite enemy of my enemy is my friend, but I think it's a case of, look, we've got an overriding need. Let's all focus on that for a while, and then we can go back to disliking each other. Or jockeying with each other for position. But obviously, yeah, Saudi, I think, the most important within that, and most important for US relations, most important for Chinese relations, I think, at the moment, in the way that China goes, in the way that Saudi goes and the path it takes. Bahrain as well, you say, very close to China now, but also the main British military base in the region. Qatar, fundamental in the negotiations with Hamas, and bridging lots of sides, but also home to Al Udeid Air Force Base. So all of these nations are pursuing a pretty interesting path at the moment. And I think they've realised that actually they don't have to be, they're not supplicants or victims anymore of this, or they're not tied in economically to the US. They've actually got options. And I think that includes in terms of dealing with Iran. So absolutely, they've got concerns. They've all got concerns with each other, let alone with Iran, and then let alone with Israel and others. It's obviously very active in terms of diplomacy there and relationships, and of course very driven by the families that control a lot of these countries. I think also they've got though that feeling that actually they've got increased power. They can have increased diplomatic, regional, cultural influence. They can have a bit more of their own path brokered by China. They don't have to rely on the US negotiation with Iran about Iran nuclear, because maybe China can achieve more about Iran nuclear than we've ever been able to do, because actually they're much more allied with each other, and the Chinese could offer a solution. Everyone says, oh, that's brilliant, Iran will deal with that, and the Arab nations say, we're fine with it too, what's your problem? And then it's sort of us and Israel sitting on the outside of that. So given some of the coups of Chinese diplomacy, I think that could be the interesting wild card in this as we go forward. I think if Iran does things that are more rogue from its allies, Russia, China, etc., then obviously that changes the variable. But you have to imagine that with the Chinese interest in Bahrain and Saudi Arabia and conversations there, that this is going back, and the Chinese are a much stronger backline to Tehran than we are. So if I were the Bahrainis and others, I'd be spending quite a lot of my time and effort on China at this point as the vector to talk about Iran nuclear, as much as they're spending with us. So they're bridging that gap. I think that's the interesting change we've seen in the last, since the last time we were really discussing Iran nuclear before COVID.
Yeah. But the other change that's obviously on the horizon is a change in Washington, isn't it? And that if you don't have Biden in power anymore, if Trump comes back, how is that going to affect Iran policy?
Well, and the problem I have with the whole Trump thing is I think everyone makes assumptions about what we think a Trump presidency could look like. And actually, I think the reality is just no one knows. Because I think his policies can change very dramatically depending on who he's been influenced by recently or anything else. And we've seen that. We've seen a big change course on Ukraine compared to what he said, but I can see that flipping back again. So I think we know what he'll do, but actually what could happen could be materially different. And this is what worries me in the miscalculation space, because people might just make assumptions about Trump's pathway or his views on something and then press the button on an action that they think the US won't contest. And the US contests it. And they weren't expecting that to happen. So I do worry about that with Trump, because you see a lot of people saying, well, a Trump presidency means this for China. It means this for Iran. So I'm not sure it necessarily does, because I think there'll be a lack of clarity over messages, or there could be clashing messages, or they'll be getting different messages from different people. I think what's without doubt is that it'll be much more focused on US national interest under a Trump presidency than we've seen recently. So that definitely plays into some of these factors. And I think in terms of Iran, obviously he was very strong on Iran towards the end of his presidency before. It's reasonable to assume that he'd pick up a strong line on Iran. But if some people influence him, particularly, say, Arab states in the Gulf, that he's very close to, Saudi Arabia, for example, influence him, actually there's a better course of action on Iran. I'm not sure that Trump is not values motivated against Iran. He's not carrying anything other than, if you like, a business mentality, I think, around it. And as long as he's told that Iran will toe the line and work better with the US, I don't think he's driven by some fundamental motivation, but the Iranian regime is wrong and we must correct it, or any of those sorts of missions. I think it's comparatively crude. And so if he doesn't like what they're doing, he'll take action about it. If he's shown a good way through by the Saudis and others, and he might say, well, that seems like a good pathway to me. And I think that's what makes him unpredictable. And it also means that we could see a change of course, because it's not led by a diplomatic stance that Iran equals bad, the Ayatollahs equal bad, I don't like the way women are treated in Iran, it's not acceptable. I think it's more driven by the fact, well, I just don't like people who stand up to the US and cause me problems. So if you're prepared to sort of agree that I'm the best president in the world ever, and you want to be friends and we can make all this work, and my Saudi friends say that actually the Ayatollah's a great guy, then you can see that opinion changing. That's what worries me. So I don't think it's absolute that he has come back to have revenge on Iran that maybe you could argue happened with Iraq in 2003. There was an element of undone business from 91. I'm not entirely sure Trump's coming back with that view. But I think it's reasonable that he will be hard on Iran, but I can see it the dynamics altered since he left government. If he comes back in, I don't think it's a given he'll pick up where he left off. That's my short version of my very long explanation.
Justin, thank you very much for joining us today. This has been super interesting.
Huge pleasure to speak to both of you. And as ever, all views are my own, and there are many, many contrary opinions to what's a very complex global environment with a lot of drivers. So I'm definitely open to any challenges from anyone. I think what I want to do is have a narrative of where this is a way we can see things going, because I think we have to work with narratives at the moment and scenarios. And for businesses, which I guess is the most interesting thing for the podcast, we have to work with scenarios, and I think where scenarios are most volatile is where we need to put the most attention. But there is opportunity on the flip side of risk again, as I said at the start. I think it's really important for us to realize that, okay, things are shifting, but you can find a way through this, and that's not a bad thing. Although, of course, risks are mounting. There are opportunities in here with changing patterns of trade, with changing focus on resource, with changing dynamics. And so, we can talk about it very depressingly, but I think you can see some of the upsides as well. One person's loss is another person's opportunity. So just to cheer up people, hopefully, it's not all doom and gloom. But obviously, it's going to require some pretty careful political and business leadership, isn't it? But thank you very much.
Just at a time when we're all changing our leaderships.
Thanks for listening. This has been Capital Horizons.
So if you would like to see or learn more about Capital Horizons, please subscribe below.
From Michael and I, see you next time.